The mop was heavy in her hands. It always felt heavier after midnight when the hallways stretched long and empty, and the silence pressed against her ears like a weight she could not shake off. Lyra had been working at the conservatory for almost 2 years now. She knew every corner of this building, every staircase, every scratch on the marble floors. She knew which doors creaked and which windows let in drafts during winter. But most importantly, she knew exactly when everyone left for the night. She was 23 years old, born into a family where music was a dream too expensive to speak out loud. Her father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. Her mother cleaned houses across the city, sometimes 3 in a single day. There was never enough money for lessons, never enough for instruments. When Lyra was 7, she had pressed her face against the window of a music store downtown and stared at a small keyboard for so long that a security guard asked her to move along. She still remembered the shame burning in her chest as she walked away. But the music never left her. It lived somewhere deep inside, humming through her blood, whispering in her dreams. She would tap rhythms on tabletops. She would hum melodies she made up in her head while doing dishes. And when she got the job at conservatory, something shifted inside her. Suddenly, she was surrounded by pianos, real pianos, grand pianos that cost more than her family had earned in 5 years combined. At first, she just listened. During her shifts, she would pause outside practice rooms and let the sounds wash over her. Students played scales, concertos, pieces she did not know the names of. She absorbed everything. The way fingers moved, the way bodies swayed, the way music could make a room feel alive. She watched through small glass windows indoors, careful not to be seen, careful not to linger too long. Just a janitor passing by, nothing more. Then one night, everything changed. It was almost 1 in the morning. The conservatory had been empty for hours. Lyra had finished her cleaning duties early. She should have clocked out, should have caught the last bus home. But instead, she found herself standing at the entrance of the main auditorium. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked because there were security cameras everywhere and nobody ever came here this late. The auditorium was massive. Red velvet seats stretched back in perfect rows. A chandelier hung from the ceiling like frozen rain. And there, in the center of the stage, sat the piano. A 9-foot grand, black and gleaming under the dim emergency lights. It looked like something from another world, something sacred. Lyra's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked around. No one, not a single soul. The security guard was in the basement watching television. She had passed him 20 minutes ago. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She climbed the steps to the stage. The piano seemed to grow larger as she approached. Her hands were trembling when she finally sat down on the bench. The keys were cool beneath her fingers. Smooth. Perfect. She had never touched anything so beautiful in her entire life. For a moment she just sat there, breathing, trying to convince herself that this was real. Then she pressed a single key. The note rang out into the empty hall, and something inside her cracked open. It was like a door she had kept locked her whole life suddenly swung wide. She pressed another key, then another. Her fingers found patterns she had memorized from countless hours of watching videos on her cracked phone screen. She had taught herself everything she knew from free tutorials online. From recordings of concerts she played over and over until she could hear every note in her sleep. She did not read sheet music. She learned by ear, by instinct, by something she could not name. That first night she played for almost an hour. Simple things, scales, fragments of songs. Her technique was rough. Her posture was wrong. But there was something in the way she touched those keys that made the music breathe. When she finally stopped, her cheeks were wet with tears she did not remember crying. After that, she could not stay away. Every night after her shift, Lyra would sneak into the auditorium. She developed a routine. She would wait until the security guard settled into his usual spot. Then she would slip through the side door, climb onto the stage, and lose herself in the piano. She practiced for hours in the dark, lit only by the faint glow of exit signs. Her fingers grew stronger. Her ear grew sharper. She started learning real pieces. Chopin. Names that had once seemed impossibly far away now became familiar friends. She made mistakes constantly. Some nights she wanted to scream from frustration. Her hands would cramp, her back would ache from hunching over the keys, but she kept going, night after night, week after week. Because when she played, she was not a janitor anymore. She was not poor, she was not invisible. She was just a girl and her music, alone in a room where no one could judge her or tell her she did not belong. Months passed, then a year. Her skills grew faster than she thought possible. There was something different about the way she learned. Other students at the conservatory had teachers correcting every small error. They had sheet music and theory classes and formal examinations. Lyra had none of that. She had only herself and an aching need to get it right. So she listened harder, practiced longer, felt the music instead of just playing it. She started recording herself on her phone, then listening back and cringing at every wrong note. She would watch professional pianists on YouTube, slow down their videos, study their hands frame by frame. Then she would return to the piano and try again, and again, and again. There was no shortcut. There was only work, only love, only the stubborn belief that if she wanted something badly enough, she could reach it with her own two hands. Nobody at the conservatory knew. Saw her as quiet and forgettable. The students walked past her like she was part of the furniture. The professors never looked twice. She wore the same faded uniform every day, pushed the same cart through the same hallways, emptied the same trash cans. And every night she played music that none of them would ever hear. Sometimes she wondered if this was all her life would ever be, a secret kept in the dark, a talent that would never see the light. She tried not to think about it too much. Thinking led to hopping, and hopping led to disappointment. She had learned that lesson young. But deep down, in a place she rarely allowed herself to visit, she dreamed of something more. She dreamed of sitting at that piano with the lights on, with people watching, with someone, anyone, finally seeing her for what she truly was. She did not know that her dream was closer than she thought. She did not know that someone had already started watching. Professor had built his entire life around music. At 62 years old, he was considered one of the finest conductors in the country. He had led orchestras across Europe. He had trained students who now performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. His family had founded the conservatory 3 generations ago, and he carried that legacy like a weight on his shoulders every single day. He had heard thousands of pianists in his lifetime. He thought he had heard everything. He was wrong. It was a Thursday night in late October. The professor had stayed late to work on arrangements for the conservatory's annual showcase, an event that brought critics and donors from across the country. He was tired. His eyes burned from staring at sheet music for hours. Around 11, he finally gathered his things and headed for the exit. But halfway down the corridor, he realized he had left his reading glasses in the auditorium. He cursed under his breath and turned back. The hallway was dark and silent. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors. When he reached the auditorium doors, he paused. There was a sound coming from inside, faint, almost like a whisper. He pressed his ear closer and his heart stumbled. Someone was playing the piano. His first thought was that a student had snuck in after hours. It happened sometimes. Eager young musicians who wanted extra practice time. He pushed the door open quietly, ready to scold whoever it was and send them home. But when he stepped inside, the words died in his throat. The stage was barely lit, just the dim glow of emergency lights casting long shadows across the seats. And there sat a young woman he did not recognize. She was small, thin. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore the gray uniform of the cleaning staff. Professor stood frozen in the doorway. She was playing Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most emotionally demanding pieces ever written for piano. Students trained for years before attempting it. Some never mastered it at all. And here was this girl, this janitor, playing it in the dark like she had been born with the music already inside her. Her technique was not perfect. He could hear small mistakes here and there. Her fingering was unconventional, her posture needed work, but none of that mattered, because underneath all of it was something he had not heard in a very long time, something raw, something real. She was not just playing the notes, she was living them. Every phrase carried a weight that made his chest ache. Every pause felt like a held breath. She played like someone who had known loss, like someone who had spent her whole life reaching for something just out of grasp. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just stood there in the shadows and listened. The piece built toward its climax. Her hands flew across the keys with a desperate energy. The music swelled and crashed like waves against rocks, and then in the final moments it softened, grew tender, faded into silence. She sat still for a long moment, her hands resting on the keys. Her shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths. She looked exhausted. She looked alive. Then she turned her head slightly, and her whole body went rigid. She had seen him. For a second, neither of them moved. The silence between them felt thick enough to touch. Then she scrambled to her feet so fast she nearly knocked over the bench. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice was shaking. "I'm so sorry, I know I shouldn't be here. Please, I'll leave right now, I won't do it again. Please don't fire me." She was already backing away from the piano, her eyes wide with fear. Professor could see her hands trembling at her sides. She looked like a small animal caught in headlights, ready to bolt at any moment. He held up a hand. "Wait." She stopped, her chest heaved with panicked breaths. He walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage. His mind was racing. He had spent 40 years searching for genuine talent. He had auditioned countless prodigies, child geniuses pushed by ambitious parents, technical wizards who could play every note perfectly but could not make you feel a single thing. And now, in the middle of the night, in his own auditorium, he had stumbled upon something extraordinary hiding in plain sight. He climbed the steps to the stage and stood a few feet away from her. Up close, he could see how young she was. Early 20s, maybe. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her uniform was worn at the edges. She looked like someone who had been working too hard for too long. "Who taught you?" he asked. She blinked. "What? Who taught you to play like that? Where did you study?" She shook her head quickly. "Nobody taught me. I never studied anywhere. I taught myself." He stared at her. "That's not possible." "It's the truth," her voice cracked. "I learned from videos, online tutorials. I watched recordings of concerts over and over. I practiced here at night when everyone was gone. I know I wasn't supposed to. I know I had no right. But I didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't have any other way." Professor was silent for a long moment. He studied her face. There was no deception there, only fear and something else beneath it, a desperate honesty that made him believe every word. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Almost 2 years. 2 years and no one knows." She shook her head. He turned and looked at the piano, then back at her. His mind was doing calculations he could not stop. The showcase was in 4 weeks. The program was already set, but programs could change. Schedules could shift. If what he had just witnessed was real, if this girl truly had what he thought she had, then he could not simply walk away and pretend this night never happened. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra." "Lyra," he repeated it slowly like he was testing the weight of it. "Do you know who I am?" She nodded, her face pale. "Your professor, your family built this place." "That's right." He paused. "And I've been listening to pianists for over 40 years. I've heard the best in the world, performers who trained at the finest schools, who had every advantage money could buy." He took a step closer to her. "I have never heard anyone play the way you just played." Her eyes widened. She looked like she did not understand what he was saying. "You have something, Lyra, something that cannot be taught, something most musicians spend their entire lives searching for and never find." His voice was firm but not unkind. "The question is, what are you going to do with it?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Professor reached into his coat and pulled out a small card. He held it out to her. "Come to my office tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock after your shift." She looked at the card like it might burn her if she touched it. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I want to hear you play again under proper lights, with time to prepare. I want to see if what I heard tonight was real or if I'm just a tired old man imagining things." He pressed the card into her hand. "Don't be late." Then he turned and walked back down the aisle. At the door, he paused and looked over his shoulder. "And Lyra, don't run away from this. You've been hiding long enough." He disappeared into the darkness of the corridor, leaving her alone on the stage with the piano and a small white card clutched in her trembling fingers. She stood there for a long time, not moving, barely breathing. Her whole body felt numb. She kept replaying his words in her head, trying to make sense of them. This had to be a dream. Things like this did not happen to people like her. But the card in her hand was real, the weight of it, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. Tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her. Now she had to decide if she was brave enough to be seen again. Lyra almost did not go. She spent the entire next day talking herself out of it. She told herself it was a trick, a test. Maybe the professor wanted to humiliate her. Maybe he was gathering evidence to have her fired. She had broken rules. She had touched equipment she had no business touching. People like her did not get opportunities. They got consequences. But when 8 o'clock came, she found herself standing outside his office door anyway. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She had changed out of her uniform into the nicest clothes she owned, a simple black sweater and dark jeans that were faded but clean. She had brushed her hair and washed her face and tried to look like someone who belonged in a place like this. She did not feel like she belonged. She felt like a fraud. She knocked. "Come in." His office was exactly what she expected. Tall lined every wall, stuffed with old volumes and sheet music. Awards and photographs covered the spaces between. A large window looked out over the campus courtyard, now dark and empty. Professor sat behind a heavy wooden desk, watching her with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." Lyra stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "I almost didn't." "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because I don't understand why you want to help me. You don't know me. I'm nobody." The professor leaned back in his chair. "Sit down, Lyra." She sat in the chair across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Let me tell you something," he said slowly. "I have spent my entire career surrounded by talented people, students with perfect technique, performers who can play any piece flawlessly, but talent alone means nothing. I've watched brilliant musicians burn out because they had no soul, no fire. They played music like it was mathematics, correct but empty." He paused. "What I heard last night was not empty. What I heard was someone who plays because they have to. Because the music is not a choice for them. It's survival." Lyra felt her throat tighten. She did not trust herself to speak. "I'm going to ask you a question," he continued, "and I want you to answer honestly. If I offered you the chance to perform at the conservatory's annual showcase, in front of critics and donors and musicians from around the world, would you take it?" Her breath caught. "The showcase? That's impossible. I'm not even a student here." "I didn't ask if it was possible. I asked if you would take it." She stared at him. The showcase was the most prestigious event of the year. She had cleaned the auditorium after last year's performance. She had swept up programs and polished the floors while imagining what it must feel like to stand on that stage with the lights blazing down. "Yes," she whispered, "I would take it." Professor nodded slowly. "Good, because I'm offering you exactly that." He stood and walked to a cabinet near the window. He pulled out a thick folder of sheet music and dropped it on the desk in front of her. Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. Lyra looked at the pages. Even she knew what this piece was. It was legendary. one of the most difficult and emotionally demanding works ever written for piano. Professional pianists spent years preparing for it. Some never performed it at all. "The showcase is in 3 weeks," the professor said. "You will learn this piece. You will perform it with our orchestra, and if you succeed, I will personally sponsor your admission to this conservatory on a full scholarship." Lyra's head was spinning. 3 weeks? That's not enough time. I've never played with an orchestra. I've never performed for anyone. I can't even read sheet music properly. "Then you'll have to learn." "But why? Why would you risk your reputation on someone like me?" Professor sat back down and looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Because 50 years ago I was you. I grew up poor. My father worked in factories. My mother cleaned other people's houses. Music saved my life, Lyra. Someone gave me a chance when no one else would. I swore that if I ever found someone with real gift, someone who had been overlooked and ignored, I would do the same." He leaned forward. "I found that person last night. Now the only question is whether you're brave enough to take what's being offered." Lyra sat in silence. Her mind was screaming 100 different warnings. This was too fast, too much. She wasn't ready. She would fail and embarrass herself and lose everything. But beneath all that fear was something else. A tiny flame that had been burning inside her since she was 7 years old, pressing her face against a music store window. That flame had never gone out. And right now, it was roaring. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it." The days that followed were the hardest of her life. She still worked her regular shifts. She had no choice. She needed the money to survive. But every evening after her work was done, she went to a small practice room that professor had arranged for her, and she played until her fingers screamed. It was brutal. It demanded everything: speed, power, emotional depth, technical precision. There were passages that seemed designed to break the human hand. There were moments of such delicate beauty that playing them wrong felt like a crime. Lyra struggled with all of it. Professor came every night to work with her. He was demanding in ways she had never experienced. He made her play the same phrase 50 times until it was right. He corrected her posture, her breathing, her hand position. He pushed her past exhaustion and then pushed her more. But he also believed in her. She could see it in his eyes, and that belief kept her going when everything else told her to quit. Word spread quickly through the conservatory. A janitor was going to perform at the showcase. The reaction was not kind. Students whispered in hallways when she passed. Some laughed openly. Others looked at her with disgust, like she was something dirty that had wandered into their clean world. She heard the comments. "Who does she think she is? This is an insult to real musicians. She's going to humiliate herself and the whole school." Even some of the professors were angry. They confronted Professor in meetings, demanding he cancel this ridiculous stunt. They said he was risking the conservatory's reputation for a publicity trick. They said it wasn't fair to students who had worked their whole lives for a chance to perform. Professor listened to all of it. Then he told them to mind their own business. But the cruelty found its way to Lyra. One evening she arrived at her practice room to find the door locked. Someone had changed the code. She stood in the hallway for 20 minutes fighting back tears until a security guard finally let her in. Another night she found a note stuffed under the door. It said 2 words: "Go home." She wanted to. God, she wanted to. Every night doubt crept into her mind like poison. Who was she to think she could do this? She had no training, no credentials, no right to stand on that stage. But then she would sit at the piano, and she would play, and the music would remind her why she was fighting. 2 weeks passed, then 2.5. The showcase was 3 days away. Lyra could play the concerto from memory now. Her technique had improved dramatically. Professor said she was ready. But she did not feel ready. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into darkness with no idea what waited below. The night before the final rehearsal with the orchestra, she sat alone in the practice room long after midnight. Her hands were sore, her eyes burned, but she kept playing. Somewhere in the building, a clock struck 1. In 48 hours, she would walk onto that stage. In 48 hours, everything would change. She just didn't know yet if it would change for better or for worse. The night arrived like a storm she could not escape. Lyra stood backstage in a borrowed black dress that did not quite fit right. It was too long at the hem and too tight across the shoulders. One of the administrative staff had found it in a storage closet, left behind from some event years ago. It was the nicest thing Lyra had ever worn, and she felt like an inside it. The auditorium was filling up. She could hear the murmur of voices through the heavy curtain. 800 seats, 800 people in expensive clothes, sipping champagne, flipping through programs. Critics from major newspapers. Donors who funded scholarships worth more than her family had ever seen. Musicians who had performed on stages around the world. And somewhere out there, Professor, who had staked his reputation on a girl who mopped floors for a living. Lyra's hands would not stop shaking. She had performed the concerto perfectly in rehearsal yesterday, every note in place, every transition smooth. The orchestra had been cold toward her at first, resentful of this outsider who had been forced into their program. But by the end of the rehearsal, something had shifted. A few of them had nodded at her. One violinist had even smiled. She had done well. But rehearsal was not this. Rehearsal did not have 800 pairs of eyes waiting to judge her. Rehearsal did not have whispers and doubts, and the weight of everything she had ever wanted pressing down on her chest. A stagehand walked past and glanced at her. "You okay? You look pale." Lyra nodded, but she was not okay. She was terrified. The showcase had already begun. Other performers had taken the stage before her. A string quartet, a soprano with a voice like crystal, a young violinist who had been training since he was 4 years old. Each performance was met with polite applause. Each performer belonged here. She did not belong here. The thought kept circling in her head like a vulture. She tried to push it away. She tried to remember what Professor had told her during their last session. "You have earned this. You have worked harder than anyone in this building. Do not let fear steal what is rightfully yours." But fear was strong. Fear had been her companion her whole life. Fear of being seen. Fear of being judged. Fear of wanting something so badly that losing it would destroy her. A voice crackled through the backstage speaker. The previous performer had finished. It was almost time. Lyra closed her eyes and tried to breathe. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. Her father's worn hands. The music store window from when she was 7. All those nights alone at the piano, playing in the dark, dreaming of a moment exactly like this one. She had come so far. She could not fall apart now. The curtain rustled. A stagehand appeared at her elbow. "You're up." She walked toward the stage on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Professor was already at the podium, facing the audience. The orchestra sat in their places, instruments ready. The weighted at the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. Lyra had played that piano 100 times in the darkness. Now it sat in a blaze of white light, surrounded by hundreds of watching eyes. The professor raised his hand, and the audience fell silent. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "I would like to introduce an unscheduled addition to tonight's program." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. People shifted in their seats. Programs rustled. 2 years ago, a young woman took a job as a janitor at this conservatory. She had no formal training, no money for lessons, no connections in the music world. But every night after her shifts ended, she would come to this auditorium and teach herself to play the piano. He paused. "I discovered her by accident 3 weeks ago. What I heard that night changed my understanding of what talent truly means." The murmurs grew louder. Lyra could see faces turning toward each other, eyebrows raised, lips curled in disbelief. She heard a soft laugh from somewhere in the middle rows. "Tonight," Professor continued, "she will perform Piano Concerto Number 2. I ask only that you listen with open hearts, ladies and Lyra." He gestured toward the wings. She stepped onto the stage. The applause was thin, scattered, polite at best. She could feel the skepticism radiating from the audience like heat from a fire. A janitor, playing, this had to be some kind of joke, some publicity stunt. She saw smirks. She saw crossed arms. She saw people already composing their negative reviews in their heads. She walked to the piano and sat down. The bench felt different than it had in rehearsal. The lights were brighter. The silence was heavier. She placed her hands on the keys and looked up at Professor. He gave her a small nod. The orchestra began. The opening chords swelled around her, dark and powerful. She counted the beats in her head, waiting for her entrance. Her hands hovered over the keys. 3, 2, 1. She played the first note. And then she froze. Her fingers stumbled. The phrase came out wrong, clumsy, broken. She heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the orchestra. She saw a critic in the front row lean over to his companion and shake his head. Panic surged through her. This was it. This was the moment she had feared. She was failing. She was proving everyone right. She was just a janitor who had no business being on this stage. Her hands trembled above the keys. The orchestra played on, waiting for her to catch up. Professor's eyes found hers. He did not look angry. He did not look disappointed. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night in the auditorium. Like he believed in her. Lyra took a breath, and then she did something she had never done before. She stopped thinking. She stopped worrying about the audience. Stopped worrying about the critics. Stopped worrying about every person who had ever told her she was not good enough. She let all of it fall away until there was nothing left but her and the piano and the music that had lived inside her since she was a child. She began to play. The second phrase came out different, stronger, cleaner. By the third phrase, her hands had found their rhythm. By the fourth, she was no longer playing the notes. She was living them. The concerto poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. All the pain she had ever felt, all the loneliness, all the nights spent dreaming of something more. It was all there in the music, raw and honest and impossible to ignore. The audience began to shift. The smirks faded. The crossed arms uncrossed. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by something they had not expected to feel. The first movement built to its climax. Lyra's hands flew across the keys with a power she did not know she had. The orchestra swelled behind her, matching her intensity. When the final chord rang out, the silence that followed was different than before. It was not skeptical. It was stunned. The second movement began, softer, more tender. This was the heart of the concerto, the place where technique mattered less than truth. Lyra played it like a prayer, like a letter to everyone who had ever been invisible, like a whisper to the little girl who had stood outside that music store window, wanting something she thought she could never have. Tears began to fall in the audience. A woman in the third row pressed a hand to her mouth. An elderly man in the balcony wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Even some of the orchestra members were blinking hard, fighting to stay composed. The third movement came like a storm, fast, furious, demanding everything she had left. Lyra gave it all. Her fingers burned. Her arms ached. But she did not stop. She could not stop. The music had taken over completely, carrying her toward something she could not name. The final passage approached, the climax of the entire concerto. Lyra struck the keys with everything in her soul. The sound filled the auditorium, shaking the walls, rattling the chandeliers. And then, with one last thundering chord, it was over. Silence. Complete and total silence. Lyra sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands still resting on the keys. She was afraid to look up, afraid of what she might see. Then someone stood, a single person in the front row, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause was deafening. It crashed over her like a wave, filling every corner of the hall. People were cheering, crying, calling out her name. 800 people who had walked in expecting nothing were now standing and clapping like they had just witnessed something they would never forget. Lyra finally looked up. Through the blur of tears in her eyes, she saw Professor at the podium. He was not clapping. He was just standing there, watching her, with a smile on his face that said everything words could not. She had done it. Against every odd, against every doubt, against every voice that had ever told her she was not enough. She had done it. And nothing would ever be the same again. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Lyra did not know what to do. She had never experienced anything like this. She stood beside the piano, her borrowed dress wrinkled from the intensity of her performance, her hair falling loose around her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. People were calling her name. Strangers were wiping their eyes. The same audience that had laughed at her introduction was now applauding like they had just witnessed history. Professor walked across the stage and stood beside her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and leaned close to her ear. "You did it," he said quietly. "I knew you would." She could not speak. She could barely breathe. All she could do was stand there and let the moment wash over her like a river she had been waiting her whole life to cross. When the applause finally faded and the audience began to take their seats again, something unexpected happened. People started leaving their rows and moving toward the stage. Critics, donors, musicians she had only ever seen in photographs. They crowded around the edge of the platform, reaching up to shake her hand, pressing business cards into her fingers, speaking words that blurred together in her overwhelmed mind. "Extraordinary. Where have you been hiding? I've never heard anything like it. Please take my card, call me tomorrow." A woman in a red gown introduced herself as the director of admissions at a famous music academy in New York. A man with silver hair said he was a talent agent who had discovered some of the biggest names in classical music. A journalist asked if she could schedule an interview for the following morning. It was too much. Too fast. Lyra felt like she was drowning in a sea of faces and voices and outstretched hands. Professor stepped in and gently guided her away from the crowd. He led her backstage, through a side door, and into a quiet hallway where the noise faded to a distant hum. "Breathe," he said, "just breathe." She leaned against the wall and covered her face with her hands. Her whole body was trembling, not from fear this time, from something else entirely. Relief, joy, disbelief, all of it mixed together until she could not tell where one emotion ended and another began. "Is this real?" she whispered through her fingers. "Is this actually happening?" "It's real," he said, "and it's only the beginning." By the next morning, Lyra's life had changed in ways she could not have imagined. Videos of her performance had spread across the internet overnight. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire concerto on their phone and posted it online. By sunrise, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By noon, it was trending on every major platform. The headlines were everywhere. Janitor stuns world with hidden genius discovered at prestigious conservatory. The cleaning lady who played like an angel. Her phone would not stop ringing. Numbers she did not recognize. Emails flooding her inbox faster than she could read them. Interview requests from television networks. Scholarship offers from music schools across the country. One message was from a famous concert hall in Europe, inviting her to perform as a guest soloist the following spring. Lyra sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her phone, unable to process any of it. Just 48 hours ago, she had been mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Now the whole world wanted to know her name. She called her mother that afternoon. It was the hardest conversation she had ever had. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Lyra, what's wrong? You never called during the day." "Nothing's wrong, Mama," her voice cracked. Something happened, something good. She told her everything. The secret nights at the piano, the professor who discovered her, the performance, the standing ovation, the offers pouring in from everywhere. Her mother listened in silence, and when Lyra finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "My baby," her mother finally said, her voice thick with tears. "My sweet, stubborn baby, I always knew you had music in you. I just never knew how to give it to you. You gave me everything, Mama. You worked so hard so I could survive. Now let me work hard so you can rest." They both cried. They cried for all the years of struggle, for all the dreams that had seemed impossible, for the little girl who had pressed her face against a music store window and wished for something she thought she could never have. That wish had finally come true. In the weeks that followed, Lyra made decisions that shaped the rest of her life. She turned down most of the offers, the flashy agents, the television appearances, the quick paths to fame that came with strings attached. Instead, she chose to stay at conservatory. Professor had kept his promise. She was admitted as a full scholarship student, the youngest person accepted through special consideration in 40 years. She traded her mop and cleaning cart for textbooks and practice rooms. She sat in classes with students who had once whispered behind her back. Some of them still looked at her with resentment, but others had changed. They had seen what she could do. They had heard the music that lived inside her, and slowly, grudgingly, some of them began to respect her. It was not easy. Nothing worth having ever was. She still had gaps in her training. She still struggled with reading sheet music as fast as her classmates. There were days when she felt like she did not belong, when the old doubts crept back in and whispered that she was fooling everyone. But then she would sit at the piano, and she would play, and the music would remind her who she was. Professor remained her mentor. He pushed her harder than any of his other students. He demanded perfection. He refused to let her coast on natural talent. "Gift without discipline is wasted potential," he told her once. "You have been given something rare. Do not squander it." She did not intend to. 3 years passed. 3 years of study, practice, growth, and transformation. Lyra graduated at the top of her class. She won competitions. She performed with orchestras across the country. Her name became known not as the janitor who got lucky, but as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. And then came the invitation she had dreamed of since childhood. Carnegie Hall, New York City, the most famous concert venue in the world. She was asked to perform as the featured soloist for a special evening celebrating emerging talent, the same concerto, Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece that had changed everything. On the night of the performance, Lyra stood backstage in a gown that fit perfectly this time. She looked out at the audience through a gap in the curtain. Thousands of people filled the seats, critics, musicians, fans who had followed her journey from the very beginning. Her mother sat in the front row, wearing a new dress Lyra had bought her, crying before the music even started. Professor was there too. He had flown in just for this night. He caught her eye from across the room and gave her the same small nod he had given her years ago, on a stage that had felt like the edge of the world. She walked out into the light. The applause greeted her like an old friend. She sat at the piano, even grander than the one at, and placed her hands on the keys. The orchestra waited. The audience fell silent. She thought of everything that had led to this moment, the poverty, the struggle, the nights alone in the dark, teaching herself to play on a piano she was never supposed to touch, the fear, the doubt, the people who said she would never be good enough. She had proven them all wrong. She took a breath, and then she played. The music filled the hall, rich and powerful and alive. Every note carried a piece of her story. Every phrase spoke of resilience, of hope, of the unbreakable belief that dreams do not die just because the world tells them to. When the final chord rang out and the audience rose to their feet, Lyra did not cry this time. She smiled, a real smile. the smile of someone who had finally found her place in the world. She had started as a girl, with nothing but a dream and a stubborn heart. She had become something more. And the music played on.